So in this segment, we're going to be talking about the Brexit Bond 5 EU rules set to spark chaos for UK businesses, ministers warn. So essentially, what Mogg is doing is he's going to set a load of sunset clauses. Now, sunset clauses are basically bits of legislation that will expire after a certain time. And so what his plan is to force basically ministers to act once the bills come up for expiry. A dumb plan, because the only time you'd want to reform legislation is when it comes up as an issue, rather than in 5 years down the line when you're forced to reform it. If there's certain bits of legislation that causes issues, that's when you look at reformation. No other time would you really bother. It's just stupid. This from a stupid man, honestly. So plans being drawn up by Johnson's government to set an expiry date for great swathes of EU law currently in use in the UK could cause chaos for businesses. Experts have warned. This is another thing that will really damage British exports. Especially given the fact that we have mutual recognition of standards temporarily for now. This will absolutely kill any chance of us to get mutual recognition of standards. Brexit Opportunities Minister Mogg is said to have told the Cabinet that he plans to introduce a 5-year expiry date for around 1,500 pieces of EU regulatory legislation, which, it's a lot of legislation, a lot of work for ministers and civil servants to deal with. And also, let's not forget the fact that there is the level playing field. If the UK gets rid of the level playing field, which it looks like Mogg really wants to do, that's going to get rid of the TCA, or at least parts of it. It's silly stuff. Lawyers and business groups have warned that blanket changes risk creating extra complexity and uncertainty for companies that are already struggling with a multitude of new rules after Brexit. Again, these aren't new rules, these are third country rules, let's always remember that. But the simple fact is, if they have to go through EU regulatory hurdles, things that show that the goods are up to EU standards, that's another problem. At the moment, we have mutual recognition of standards, but, like stuff like the UK CA mark, it's going to make exports way more difficult to do. And when businesses have to go through multiple regulators, it just causes them endless headaches. And for small manufacturers, small businesses, their businesses won't be viable anymore. That's going to be a problem. Eleanor Dews, a lawyer who worked on the 2018 EU Withdrawal Act, told The Independent that a self-imposed cliff edge for retained EU law is a recipe for potential chaos, saying, warning of the danger in changing so many rules affecting the economy without scrutiny. And again, it's going to make ministers do last-minute changes, and there's not going to be any parliamentary scrutiny or public scrutiny. What if the public don't actually want changes to these laws? What if the government doesn't have a mandate to change these laws? Suddenly they're going to be changed potentially. This proposal has the potential to drive investment away from the UK at a time when we really need it. We're falling down in the foreign direct investment leaderboard, and it's just a recipe for causing more chaos, honestly, more uncertainty. The British Chamber of Commerce also warned against deregulation for its own sake. These are people who represent businesses. If they're the ones saying that deregulation can be an issue, then even pro-business types are going to see it as a problem. The Chamber of Commerce saying we should not complicate our trade relationships by diverging so far it makes UK standards and services unsellable into Europe. Services are already a huge issue. This won't be related to services that much, considering we struggle to export services into the EU as is. But if we create a system which makes it really difficult for the UK to export goods into the EU, we're cutting ourselves off further from our biggest market. That's the key problem. William Bain, the BCC's head of trade policy, told The Independent the government is keen to use the forthcoming Brexit Freedoms Bill to get rid of EU rules by bringing in sunset clauses that will force ministers to stick to them, amend them or ditch them by the end of a 5-year period according to the Times. So it's not the worst thing in the world to do. He's not getting rid of it, in a blanket sense. It will force ministers to really figure things out. But, when you've got large pieces of legislation that could be phased out, you're asking them to make amendments to them. You're talking incredibly large things that, relate to possibly healthcare, procurement, water, energy, all of these different sectors. Huge pieces of work here, especially when the government are downsizing the civil service. How are they supposed to make any amendments? The most likely situation is they're just going to stick to them, which makes this whole exercise pointless, but it adds so much uncertainty around the UK, around are we going to keep these laws or not? Do you really want to invest in the UK when we could deregulate at any moment and just cause issues for yourselves to export? Why would you want to do that? It doesn't make any sense. Especially when we do, even if we do deregulation and your company sticks to high standards so you can export to the EU, you're going to have to prove that you're up to the EU standards, which is another barrier. Mogg is said to have told the Cabinet earlier this month about the plan to set expiry dates on 1,500 pieces of EU legislation in a bid to force radical thinking from government departments. The only thing we can hope is that a Labour government comes in within the next couple of years and just gets rid of these sunset clauses. Jonathan Jones, QC, the government's former legal chief who quit over its Brexit policy, said the plan was potentially very dangerous since it would make it almost impossible for Parliament and the relevant industries to scrutinise each change, because these amendments will happen fairly quickly, because, when are they going to look at these laws? It's not going to be in the second or third year, it's going to be the fourth and fifth year, which doesn't give ministers or industry enough time to really look at the changes. Having sunset clauses in a blanket way for huge amounts of legislation is a very idea, Jonathan Jones told The Independent. To change swathes of the law automatically is a recipe for uncertainty for businesses and consumers and everyone else. It's just silly. That's the whole point of it. If there are specific bits of legislation Mogg wants amended, why doesn't he just talk to those relevant ministers instead of trying to force them to do this? Jones continued, if you scrap some rules, this is really interesting stuff here. He goes, if you scrap some rules on food safety automatically, for instance, say, for example, if, the government don't pay enough attention to these sunset clauses and, these rules are just phased out, what happens? He says, either there will be no rules or do you revert to some existing laws in Britain from 1973, which I think is before we joined the then European Union, what it was called before, its predecessor. It's bizarre, and that's a great question. What happens? Do we revert back to no laws in these fields, or do we revert back to the laws from 1973? I'm assuming it would be no rules then, wouldn't it? Because those rules from 73 wouldn't be on the books anymore, right? They'd be gotten rid of or superseded. So again, it's a really bizarre one. Mr. Duh said, Mr. added, to keep change or scrap 1,500 pieces of legislation is a huge job at a time when ministers want to cut civil service resources. Who is going to undertake this exercise, and what is it that won't get done because of it? And that's a great point there. What will not get done because of this? Ministers are going to be really busy dealing with these older pieces of legislation, right? What about adding new things? Like, for example, if these bits of laws were meant to phase out, right, during the pandemic, for example, if the timeline fit like that, they'd be way too busy to deal with all of this nonsense. And then once those laws are phased out because of the sunset clauses, what happens then? It's just stupid. The TUC has demanded that the government makes clear that workers' rights will be protected during the so-called bonfire of Brussels regulations. Again, this is another one where the UK added a lot of workers' rights, not necessarily because of the EU, but during the time we were a member of the EU. So would the sunset clauses get rid of that as well? Because then we're reverting to 1970s worker regulations potentially, and then what happens to those worker rights that were added since then? The government have promised to reform workers' legislation to make it stronger, but they haven't done so. They've had since 2019 to do so. The leading union fears that Mogg's plans could see some protections removed or watered down without proper scrutiny by Parliament. And again, that's another one. The government are talking about adding new legislation so agency workers can replace striking workers. I mean, it's just crazy. Mogg's officials at the Cabinet Office have said that more than 2,000 ideas about making the most of Brexit have been received from the public, and they've only published 9. And a load of them are rubbish. One's about 1,400 watt vacuum cleaners. Again, what are you vacuuming at that point? Making agency workers have less rights than permanent workers. Rubbish. I've covered the 9 proposals. They're really, really bad. Among the best ideas were, the 1,400 watt vacuum cleaner. A spokesperson said the Brexit Freedoms Bill will empower Parliament to think boldly about what we want to maintain certain aspects of retained EU law. And again, if there are bits of EU law that we want reformed, why don't we just go ahead and reform them then? Why are we waiting for these sunset clauses, which are just going to add loads of pressure and lower the scrutiny? I know this government hates scrutiny. I know they run away from journalists and hide in fridges, etc. But why don't they just say, look, we want to reform these bits of the law? Why add sunset clauses? It just adds added pressure where it does not need to exist. Ridiculous. Also, the fact that it makes Britain's place in the world very uncertain, going to kill foreign direct investment, and it's going to make it harder for us to export to the EU. Our largest single trading partner. That one that's on our doorstep, geographically close to us. As we move to a world that's going to look more green, why would we want to do trade with countries that are miles away from us? It doesn't make sense. You're going to be burning through so much fossil fuel to get to these other countries when people can swim in the English Channel, swim across it. It's just ridiculous. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.